For those of you following the news of what's going on in Israel, there's a lot to take in. The politics, the violence, the military, there's changes on almost a daily basis of what's happening. It's hard to keep up. But I want to talk about a few of the recent events. In particular, a couple of weeks ago, you may have seen on the news that in one of the settlements, there's an attack on a hummus restaurant. 2 Palestinian gunmen went in and fired and shot and killed 4 Israeli civilians. An 18-year-old, a 63-year-old, a 17-year-old, and a 21-year-old, who had stopped on the side of the road to get some hummus and falafel. These attacks were condemned, but then, the next day, something happened. In some of the Palestinian areas around the settlements, groups of Israeli settlers went out and set fire to homes, to businesses, attacked Palestinian civilians in response, out of vengeance and revenge. And what happens in the New York Times the next day, the day after this attack that killed 4 Israeli civilians? There's a small article about it and a big article instead about the violence. And it's understandable. Condemning the violence is correct. We should all condemn settler violence. There is no excuse for it against innocent people. And that's what they were. Innocent Palestinian civilians. And that's the danger I want to talk about a bit this morning. It was interesting to see the voices that spoke out strongly against the settler violence. A couple of statements from the Israeli government and some different officials. There's the IDF Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, who said at a graduation ceremony for combat officers, an IDF officer who stands by when seeing an Israeli citizen planning to throw a Molotov cocktail at a Palestinian house cannot be an officer. That was a strong condemnation, rightly so. Another Rabbi Moshe Lichtenstein, one of the co-roshei yeshivot of the Har Etzion yeshiva, a yeshiva that's very well known in one of the settlements in the West Bank. His father, Aharon Lichtenstein, was a great rabbi, someone I admired very much. And after his statement this week, I have some admiration as well for Rabbi Moshe Lichtenstein. He's put out a statement condemning the violence, condemning the silence that came from so many other religious leaders in the settlements, and explained that besides just the moral wrong of it all, its greatest danger, its greatest harm that this does. In his words, he says, it pulls the rug out from under our claim to morality in the face of those who harm us. And that's the truth. The violence that happens there makes it that much harder to be a Zionist over here when settlers attack civilians. It makes it that much harder to defend the state of Israel. It makes it that much harder to voice support for the state of Israel. And it makes it that much harder to justify or to state that the New York Times should be giving more attention to what happens when a Palestinian gunman murders innocent civilians. It makes sense that the next day there's an article instead about the aftermath of the attack, interviews with the families bearing children. That's what they are, a 17-year-old, an 18-year-old, a 21-year-old. When I was that age, I thought I was an adult. They're children. Parents bearing their sons. Someone having to bury their spouse, their partner, their father. That's what the article should have been about. But understandably, they were about instead the violence that was perpetuated back out of vengeance and revenge. An act of zealotry. An act that a few in the Israeli cabinet and the government condemned, and yet others condemned the police arresting the settlers that they caught, the few they actually went after. Now you may ask, what's wrong with zealotry? It's in our parsha this week. We see Pinchas rewarded for his act of zealotry, for taking justice into his own hands. What could be wrong with that? It's in the Torah. The rabbis are very uncomfortable with this act. All throughout rabbinic literature, they make comments about this act. Some condemn it outright. Some are a little more quiet about it, but they show how they're uncomfortable with an act of zealotry. One of the commentators actually tells us that if Zimri, the Israelite that Pinchas slayed, had turned around and killed Pinchas, it would have been an act of self-defense. There would have been no punishment for him because he was under attack. Not execution by law, but attack. And yet, he gets rewarded. He gets this blessing of peace. What are we to make of that? Why? In the Gemara and the Talmud, the rabbis learn from this story a lesson that's codified in Jewish law and halakha. From one of the verses, when Pinchas gets up, V'yakam mitocha edah, he got up from amongst the congregation, v'yikach romach beyado, and he took the spear in his hand. And the rabbis say, here he was sitting with the congregation learning Torah from Moses. Notice he didn't have his spear then. He got it afterwards, when he left the congregation. And the law they have is that it's forbidden to enter a place of study, a Beit Midrash, a place where you learn Torah, while carrying a weapon. Because the two don't go together. Torah and violence don't fit together. And what's interesting also about the statement is that it's not part of Pinchas' character. It's not his nature. He wasn't habitual in carrying a weapon on him. It was something out of character. He was habitually learning Torah. He was the descendant of Aaron, the high priest, a man known for a great blessing of peace, a man known and praised for bringing peace to the community, for bringing peace to others. It was out of Pinchas' nature, the rabbis tell us, even those that explain that the blessing was deserved. And why is that significant? Because they tell us, after an act of violence like that, it's very easy for it to become a part of your nature. It's very hard to go back to being a man of peace after being a man of violence, after participating in that act of zealotry. And that is why they say it wasn't a reward, it was a necessity, God's blessing. In order for him to return to who he was, he needed a blessing of peace. Because habitually, you do one act, it gets a little bit easier to do another, and another, and another. In another midrash on our parsha, Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta says that no vessel can contain blessing other than peace. And he cites a verse, God will give strength to God's nation, God will bless God's nation with peace. Peace is the vessel which contains all blessing, our tradition teaches. Peace is the ultimate goal and the ultimate reward and the ultimate purpose for our nation and our people. And that's always been Israel's blessing throughout history, to be a vessel of peace, a nation of peace. A nation that can pick up a spear and defend itself against an enemy when needed, but then put that spear down and be the first ones to respond to natural disasters around the world, be the first ones to respond to Jews in need around the world, be the first ones to protect its citizens, be the first ones to build in the middle of a desert an oasis, a nation of technology, medical inventions, agriculture, to bring life to the desert, but then to pick up that spear when necessary. Israel's mission is the Jewish mission, to be a blessing to the nations of the world. And we in the diaspora have a mission as well, to support the people of Israel. Even when we disagree with the state and the government and its actions, even when we disagree with the violence taken by some of the citizens, we have a mission to support the state of Israel. And sometimes that mission is done by speaking up and speaking out. Supporting the voices that are standing up within the Israeli government and Israeli society to make sure that Israel remains a nation blessed with peace, a nation blessed with prosperity, a nation that picks up the spear to defend itself within the realm of law and order, with justice, not with vengeance, not with anger. A nation that can always defend itself against threats, but not a nation of zealots. And that's our mission. So this Shabbat, I ask us to think about how we can contribute in that mission of supporting those voices, of supporting those people, of supporting Israel as a nation of blessing, a nation of peace. Shabbat Shalom.